Good morning, everyone. Welcome to Insight. As I just gave away, it's Sunday morning, so Tony and I are not making cocktails today, but we promise next week we'll be back with more cocktail recipes.
So this week we have a great program that embodies German Romanticism with a capital R. So let's start talking about what is Romanticism. Obviously it's the era that follows the classical period of Mozart and Haydn. What is Romanticism in spirit, and how does it differ from its classical predecessor, even though there are some structural and constructs that are similar between the two periods?
So, in literature, Romanticism is a movement that begins in the late 18th century. Music's always a bit later. Music always drags behind literature. The simplest way to think about it is a focus on human individuals as heroes. That's an easy way to think about it. So in the case of music, when Beethoven writes his Third Symphony, the Eroica, in 1803, 1804, he entitles it to the memory of a great hero. Now, when he discovers that Napoleon has declared himself emperor, he cancels that out. Instead of dedicating it to Napoleon, he says it's to a hero in general, which we assume is Beethoven. So this idea of the artist being protagonist, the artist expressing his own feelings, his own sense of grandeur, his own sense of loss, of love. Human emotions are magnified and made the center of the musical argument. And if you think about classicism, like music from Mozart's and Haydn's period, although those elements are present sometimes, they aren't the most important thing. There are more important things like balance and phrase structure that is elegant. And classicists, Mozart and Haydn, thought of music as being pleasing. The idea of music was that it would please you. When Beethoven came along, he laughed at that. He thought that was too small. He wanted music to move you, to stir the deepest passions, to give you an impression of the infinite. And that's quite a different thing from Mozart. Yeah. So even though Beethoven is a classicist, he very much has a foot in both worlds. And of course, the generation after Beethoven, Berlioz, Schumann, Mendelssohn, then we really see the absolutely pure romantics.
Right. And while this could be debated at great length, many people identify the Eroica, his Third Symphony, as the birth or a birth of Romanticism in symphonic repertoire. So what are a couple of the devices that Beethoven uses that is sort of would call out that this is Romanticism in its earliest stages?
Well, the size of the symphony. It's the longest symphony that's ever been written. It's got 3 horns. It's got this huge first movement, which begins with these 2 very famous chords, 2 E-flat major chords that immediately tell you this is on a different scale from everything before. The harmonic language is greater. He goes into more unusual areas. The development section of the first movement is far longer than it's ever been before.
Right.
The second movement then is a funeral march for the hero. That's very specific. But it's generally just the scale and the emotional range of the piece that sets us apart from what's gone before.
Right. Yeah, that first movement is so much more working out of problems than I think we've seen in anything previous. But so the program actually ends with maybe the other bookend of German Romanticism, Richard Strauss's Metamorphosen, written at the very tail end of World War II. So where has Romanticism come to this point, nearly 150 years on?
Well, the normal music history story is that Romanticism goes from Beethoven up to 1913, when Stravinsky writes The Rite of Spring, and Schoenberg is also writing his early atonal pieces. And the usual story is that those are the 2 lines. One of the German line through Schoenberg comes to an end with modernism. This new Russian line with Stravinsky becomes the kind of dominant musical force of the 20th century. And that works because lots of people like Mahler, died.
Yes.
If Mahler had lived on, his musical language would have continued, but Mahler conveniently dies right at that moment, and that line seems to come to an end, except for the lone figure of Richard Strauss. In 1913, Richard Strauss is still a reasonably young man. He's had very famous operas that have been seen as modernism, like Salome and Electra. Those have both been seen as examples of German Romanticism. But then he does a U-turn. At the point where Stravinsky and Schoenberg are representing these new lines of modernism, Strauss retreats from the front line slightly. And I don't want to over-exaggerate that, because often it is exaggerated the degree to which he retreated, but there's definitely a shift in style between Salome and Electra, which are very aggressive, upsetting, deliberately disturbing modernist pieces of expressionist modernism, to Der Rosenkavalier, his next opera, which seems to go back to musical language from further in the past. Now, it's got lots of bits that don't do that, but it's still elegant. It's about an aristocratic story, so that takes us back into the 19th century. It's full of Viennese waltzes, which are a very familiar trope for the audience. So there is this kind of turn away from modernism into something that looks back to the 19th century. Now, it's 1914 at this point. Strauss lives until 1949. And during that entire period, he continues to write music that sounds like it has one foot in the 19th century. It's not music that's modernist in trying to shock the audience, but it continues to have this romantic idea of expressing heroic or the feelings of the protagonist. So Strauss writes many operas in this vein, lots of music. Towards the very end of his life, he enters this period that's sometimes called his Indian Summer. During the Second World War, Strauss had seen all the scenes of his triumph, the opera houses and concert halls of Germany, bombed one after another. And in 1945 comes the bombing of Dresden, which is the last city that's standing. And the destruction of that city is so upsetting to him that he begins to write this piece, Metamorphosen, as a kind of memorial to German culture, which has been completely obliterated at this point. And he, as the most famous living German composer, obviously feels that in a very personal way. This is his culture, it's the culture that he was steeped in, he grew up in. So he begins to write a piece unlike anything else he ever wrote, a symphonic poem for 23 solo strings, so every single string instrument is playing an independent line. And he does this to commemorate German culture. And whether by accident or on purpose, we don't know, he bases the whole thing on a theme that's derived from the slow movement of Eroica, the funeral march, and particularly the rhythm ba-bum, ba-bum, beat, on this heavy, laden, downtrodden rhythm that is so characteristic of the theme in the Beethoven. That becomes the starting point, the point of departure for the whole piece. And he writes this incredibly dense 25-minute piece, incredibly full of counterpoint, incredibly German, you know, in the density of the construction, but very free in terms of its structure. And at the very end of the piece, he finally states an explicit quotation of the music from the Eroica slow movement in the basses, and he writes in memoriam underneath, as if to really underline that this is the end, if you like. Yeah. Strauss did write a couple of pieces after this. He wrote the oboe concerto, the duo concertante for clarinet and bassoon, the four last songs. Right. But those are not lighter pieces, but there's particularly in the oboe and the clarinet and bassoon pieces, a kind of classicism that's looking even further back. But in Metamorphosen, we have this very weighty, strong testament to German music as a kind of farewell. He knew that he was the end of this line. He knew nobody else was writing music like this anymore. And I think he very deliberately wrote this piece as a kind of end. So when we designed this program, we had the pieces the other way around, because I didn't want everybody to leave the concert hall and slit their throats after listening to Metamorphosen, because it ends really bleak, C minor. But because of COVID, we have to go large to small in terms of the size of pieces.
Mm-hmm.
So we have to play Eroica first. So it means that you're getting the story chronologically.
Yeah.
And in many ways, leaving the concert hall with the C minor ringing in your ears from the Strauss is perhaps a more poignant way of thinking about what actually happened. And I think that listening to music from a German composer, and remember, a German composer who was a member of the Nazi Party. He was denazified later because he'd only had a very kind of, he'd signed up to, he had to become a member of the party to have a job at one point in his career. And Strauss was very naive, and he had Jewish members of family who were put in concentration camps. But he also he was naive and quite foolish about the degree to which his involvement gave a thumbs up to the Nazi regime, and he couldn't understand why he had to be denazified, and it betrays a kind of lack of deep thinking.
Right.
But at the same time, his involvement was extremely minor, and it's almost like this is the first time in his music that we see the consequences of what's been happening in Germany politically for the last 10 years. Mm-hmm. Strauss almost kind of hovered above it in this kind of ideal detachment, but this piece really brings it home. And of course, for us, it's complicated because we tend to see the Second World War as a kind of binary of good and evil, and there are all these grey areas of which Strauss is very much one, where there's an enormous amount of good that was happening at the same time.
Right. Well, I think it's a really satisfying arc between these two pieces, and sometimes you'll program pieces that just sonically work together, and in this case, they certainly complement one another, if not are demonstrating a very direct thread, and I'm really excited to be hearing this. So please join us on Friday or Saturday evening at 7:30, and if you're not able to make it, we'll be streaming the concert on Friday evening on our YouTube channel or on our website. So thank you. Looking forward to this week.
Me too.
And see you at the hall.
See you soon.